Welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast, brought to you by the All About Pigeons nonprofit organization, which is dedicated to promoting education and promotion of the pigeon hobby. Every week, a listener requests to drive our conversations about all things pigeons. Join me, Philip Fry, as we learn and share stories about these incredible birds and this ancient hobby. Today, we're going to be talking about racing pigeon loft design with Bill Weima. So, Bill, thanks for coming on and talking with us today.
Hey, my pleasure.
So, can you give the listeners your own background into racing pigeons?
Yeah, I've been racing steadily since 2011 at this location. I had birds on and off a few times before that. Obviously, grew up as a farm boy. I had every animal under the sun growing up, and used to show pigs and cattle and sheep, and had a horse and chickens and pheasants and all the everything, right? So. But yeah, the pigeons have been the only thing for the last 15 years, and it's a big part of my life. So
And where is it that you're racing out of right now?
I race out at Guelph, Ontario, which is about an hour due west of Toronto.
And what are the racing club that you're with right now?
I race out of the Flamborough Racing Pigeon Club in one combine called the North Road Racing Pigeon Association. I'm actually the president of that organization. There's another combine that races from the east. It's called the East Course Combine. I've been a member of it for many years as well, and I race with the Waterloo Wellington Club on that course. This year we've started to overlap a little bit where they have come on with us due to declining numbers on the East Course. They've been coming on for a few of the longer races with us to try to help them out.
And so before we start getting into all the details and stuff like this about racing pigeon loss, let's just clear it up that everyone's in different climates, situations, and things like this. But there's also universal truths when it comes to building and design features and stuff of racing pigeon lofts. So with that, people who are listening and maybe you're working on another loft or something like that, or adjusting features with your own loft, just if you hear something you want to try it out, just take that into consideration. People in a hot climate compared to a really cold or wet or dry, everyone has different situations. So build your loft somewhat accordingly in that aspect. So for instance, Bill, you get pretty cold winters up there, don't you?
Yeah, we're in a pretty cold climate up here. There's a lot of different systems to flying, especially young birds. Up here, predominantly everyone flies under the darkening system. We simply don't have enough time to put the birds through a light program where you're cutting, maybe 8, 9, 10th flight and shutting the birds down and give that flight time to grow back in. Our racing started this past weekend in one combine. We start next weekend in another, and we're usually finished by the end of September. So a lot of my friends in the U.S., Texas, California, Arizona, they start racing when we finish. So it's a big difference, right? And then of course we have the winter on top of that. So breeding quality youngsters in January when it's minus 20 Celsius outside is a challenge. Yeah, like we said, every location's different. So
Yeah, even to the point where you have almost different racing seasons.
right, yeah.
So first things first, when you're looking at your property, what would be some of the factors that you think about when you're just looking at a blank property? You got your house out there. Where would you first look at your property for putting that racing loft?
Ideally, it's you want to try to get a southeast exposure if you can to try to get the sunlight as much as possible, the morning sunlight. Later in the day when it gets really hot, it's kind of nice to have it on the side or the back of the loft, not directly in the loft. I find, depending on where you are, do you have a clear line of flight in? Do you have buildings in the way? Those are all contributing factors to where you would locate it. Can you put it high in the air? Can you put it down low? I mean, I know some people have second story lofts. They'll have a garage underneath, and they'll have the pigeon lofts up on the second story, and that has some added benefits because if you're heating the garage, then the floor of the loft on the second floor is always going to be a little bit warm, which helps keep it dry. So, there's different things to think about, right?
And the other side of it too would be, how do you feel about multiple lofts, like multiple smaller lofts, or one large loft that are sectioned off for like breeding and separating the cocks and hens?
Yeah, I think breeding loft ideally should be separate from your racing loft. But I've had, since I've been here, I've had multiple different buildings for racing lofts. I had the old birds in one section and young birds in three other lofts. And I would fly one loft on one combine in one direction and a different loft the other direction, and that's that's great to keep young birds separate and straight. But then when you want to fly them as old birds and you want to combine them all, I would fight for weeks to break them to the old bird loft. I mean, they could see the old bird loft from the young bird loft and vice versa. At the end of the young bird season, I take all those birds that I'm keeping and I put them over to the old bird loft where they sit in the aviary all winter and they're looking at their young bird loft. And then I let them out in the spring and they go and hang on the screen for 3 weeks trying to get back in that young bird loft. Like it's just brutal. Like a couple of years ago, I lost 31 yearlings to the hawks because they would just pick them off of that, hanging around that loft. They trying to get in there, and it's a nightmare. So I'm a big advocate now of having one racing loft. Ideally, have one trap into a front hallway, and then go left or right. Have sliding doors, pocket doors, whatever you need. You can have your old birds, your young birds, everything traps into the same spot. That you don't have that fight to deal with at all. Sure makes life easier.
Right. Yeah. Work with that natural habit where they want to come back to where they were born and
Right. You can't punish them for it. They're just doing what you've trained them so hard to do, right?
right. So, and this goes back to climate and stuff like this, but what kind of floors do you prefer in your loft setups?
Well, again, here in this climate, because of the cold, we pretty much have to have a plywood floor.
Yeah.
Uh, Pretty much have to have everything closed up. I visited lots of guys in the southern states, and they're all up on expanded metal, wide open floors, and lots of air, and that's great. It has downfalls too we can talk about, but yeah, here when you're darkening, you need basically a pretty solid loft. You got to be able to close the windows off and darken it down so that they only have 8 hours of daylight a day. Doesn't really matter when that 8 hours is. You kind of can work that around whatever your personal schedule is. My shop is only 5 minutes from home, so I have the luxury of coming back and forth 2 or 3 times a day if I want to. So what I tend to do is I'll take them out of the dark noon, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they'll go to bed with natural light, and then I close the loft up so that in the morning when when the sun's up, it's darkened. It stays darkened until I come home. It doesn't really matter when, but eight hours a day for about 8 weeks is kind of the minimum to put them through the proper darkening system. And that's inherently there's a lot of problems with that. The biggest problem with darkened loft is ventilation. Obviously, if you're closing everything off and closing the light off, you're also closing off a lot of the airflow. So you really got to think about how you're building the loft to try to minimize the restriction of your ventilation. Especially if you're closing the loft off and you got the sun beating down on it, it's hot inside, and
Yeah.
they're locked up like that until 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You got to keep air moving.
So what do you do to keep air going through when you got everything blocked off?
I have a fan up in the attic space. In the front wall of the loft, I have about 18 inches of perforated metal that runs the length of the bottom of the front wall, and it's a double layer. It's on the outside of the stud and it's on the inside of the stud, so that pretty much stops the light from coming through the perforation. And then in the ceiling, right up against the front wall, I have sliding panels in the ceiling that I can open and close right? So I can control the amount of draft that comes through that front wall. And an interesting thing too is even in the evening when I go in there when the loft's not darkened, you can sometimes go in there and depending on what's going on outside, you can actually feel cold air coming down through the ceiling. So then it's important to be able to close those shutters off in the ceiling to control the air. Big thing to keeping birds informed, I believe, is to minimize the temperature fluctuations between day and night. And I think that's a big downfall that a lot of the southern lofts have. They normally have very warm days, probably very warm evenings as well, overnight. But for example, I was at the Gulf Coast Classic several years ago, and it went down to I think it was 42 degrees Fahrenheit the weekend of the final race. And I'm visiting guys' lofts, and it's like, guys, you're losing all the form on your birds right now because you don't have any system in place to close off that floor, right? The cold air is just coming in, blowing around, and so those are all things to think about when you're, in a different area. If I were to build a loft in the southern states where I had the luxury of having it up and on the expanded metal flooring, I would definitely have some sort of a panel that I could lay on the floor at night in the racing loft to try to minimize that temperature fluctuation.
Yeah, that big drop. So you were also talking about that expanded flooring, some of the other downfalls that you could run into having that. What were some of the other problems that would come about having that?
One of the, I mean, obviously predators is an issue. Raccoons and weasels, and I mean, a little weasel can squeeze through the smallest of spaces, right? So you've got to find the right size perforated or expanded metal flooring that keeps them out, but still lets the droppings drop down through. If you have the luxury of putting the loft up, 4 or 5 feet in the air, then of course you're not going to have a problem with a raccoon reaching up through and grabbing a bird or something, or there's things like that. I guess another issue they have down there that we don't have is snakes. I often read of some friends in the States that get these rat snakes or whatever in the loft and eating baby pigeons and stuff like that. Well, we don't have that situation up here, so it's not a consideration. But yeah, different things every place, right? So
Yeah, that's the snakes have been in. I'm in Arizona, so we get a lot of snakes, and that's been something that every breeding season they'll just come through and decimate eggs and babies, and so we're trying to bury 1/4 inch mesh and bring it up 2 feet, and so yeah, snake proofing is pretty tough too, and that's
right.
another thing too with the lost predator proofing. And I've seen pictures where a bird of prey will actually get into some guy's loft sometimes, and then
Hmm.
the mess they can cause so much devastation when they get in there. What do you think would be a good way to help keep BOPs out of the loft?
I had one great horned owl in my loft one day, um, and surprisingly, it didn't really cause any damage. I think he was as upset with himself being in there as I was with him being in there. The birds, of course, were all freaked out. They were all hanging on the wire, but he was just standing on the feeder, just calmly standing there looking around. And I'm a welder by trade. I went in and put my safety glasses on and put my big leather gloves on, and I thought, okay. I went in with a broomstick in my hand, and I thought, okay, I'm ready, right? And I just literally opened the door and just gently nudged him out. I was actually touching him like on his chest, right? And he was just looking at me with those big eyes, and then he saw the door was open, and away he went and never came back.
Uh,
So he must have followed a late pigeon in, in the evening, didn't see the bobs or whatever, just followed it in, and boom, right there it was, right? But yeah, Cooper's hawks, I've had a couple of them in the loft, and yeah, same deal. They just went right through the bobs, and that's another issue. So I don't think there's really any way of preventing that from happening, other than get your birds in and close it off so that nothing can get in or out, right? But
let's say you have a property that has an open area or a treat area. Would you put it more towards the open area, or would you put it more towards the trade area?
I would pick the open area for sure.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah, especially most of these. I mean, we don't really have too many peregrine falcons up here. Not in my area, but not in Ontario generally. There's not a lot of them. Cooper's hawks are the number one threat up here with a bird of prey. And they're typically an ambush bird, right? So they like to sneak out of the trees and scoot, just over top of something and ambush. Whereas the peregrine just, peregrine bears down on you and you're done, right? And interesting too. I've heard people say that the birds somehow know if it's a peregrine. My buddy Ken, he says when the birds see a peregrine, they land in the big cedar trees. Because they know the peregrine won't dive into the tree. Whereas if it's a Cooper hawk, they fly. They'll because they know they can generally outfly the Cooper, right? They won't go in the tree because they'll get ambushed, right? So it's unbelievable how the bird knows the difference.
It makes sense. They've known each other as predator
Yeah,
and prey for a long time, so
right.
I
Yeah,
guess that they would. You're using the wood floor in there. Do you use any kind of a deep litter system, or are you just going in there and scraping it out every now and then?
I've done a couple of different things. This year, I did a deep litter system. I hate looking at the loft, but I can honestly say that the health in the loft has been very good. Young bird sickness goes hand in hand with darkening. It just, you're darkening the birds, they're young, they're still growing, you're forcing them through a body mold, you're closing off the ventilation, you're restricting the daylight, and that devil's going to come. That young bird sickness seems to come. So I've got lofts where I have I have a 2x6 floor with plywood on the bottom side, and on the top side I have wire. And I did that so that when the birds get young bird sickness and they're throwing up and they're other birds can't run over and eat that grain because it drops down through. Definitely seems to have helped. But like I say, this year I tried the deep litter system, and kind of by accident, actually, is I did some breeding in one of the young bird lofts. I had about 12 pair in there, and I let them raise 2 rounds, and I left the youngsters in there with them. And and then when I pulled them out, I pulled the breeders out. I left all the young birds in that section, and I left all the nest bowls and everything just the way it was when breeding was over. I was just really busy. I didn't have time to get in and clean it. And I thought, okay, well, it's all dry. I'm going to try this and see what happens. Right. And no young bird sickness, none.
Oh wow.
Is it coincidental? I don't know, but it's definitely an interesting observation. So,
You can design a loft well the first time, and if it's designed well, if it ventilates well, you're just saving yourself a lot of headaches when it comes to birds getting sick from, improper, they're getting wet or whatever, or yeah, old food sitting around for them to eat.
dry is paramount. You got to minimize, any water getting in the loft through rain or you know, snow or whatever. You got to minimize that as much as possible. I think that's a big key. If it's dry, it's healthy. And as terms of building, be careful what wood you use too. I mean, it's really hard to get any dry wood anywhere, but definitely don't use treated wood. Pressure treated stuff. It's got an odor to it. It gives off. It takes a year for that stuff to really dry out and that odor to be gone. Cedar's a big no-no, right? Cedar's not good for pigeons. And I remember reading a story one time about that where some pretty well-off fella built himself a beautiful loft entirely out of cedar and couldn't figure out why his birds were so sick. And some other club member came over and looked, come over to see if they could see what was going on. And as soon as they saw the loft, they're like, dude, this is what's wrong with your pigeons, right? You can't build, you can't put pigeons in the cedar loft. They get sick from it, right? So again, it just gives off this odor that's not healthy for them. Painting's another thing. I don't like painting lofts, right? The inside, I think I like it just to be bare. So, but yeah, for the guys that are in the southern states, you look at a lot of the big one loft races, they're steel frames, they're steel floors, it's like a steel structure. It'll last forever. Maybe they do that because they're in, Tornado Alley. I don't know, but it's definitely, you can get in there and pressure wash it all off, and that's that's an advantage to that, whereas you can't really do that so much with wood, right?
So with your breeding loft, so you actually have a separate loft then for your breeders outside of your for your racers.
Yeah, I actually have when I bought this place, there's a 30 by 30 garage, and I built individual breeding pens inside the garage. I love the individual pens. Again, air quality is a problem. In the wintertime, it's cold. I got a furnace in there. I keep it at 45 degrees Fahrenheit just to keep, stop the water from freezing and whatnot. Don't want it real warm. But yeah, it's minus 20 outside. You get more humidity than you like. You can't really change the air that often. I mean, I'll open the door up every day for a few minutes and just let the air change, because you got to warm it back up again. But it's not ideal for sure. There's a little saying up here about May babies go all the way, right? And everybody tries to breed those early birds in January and even December, so that you can barely get bands on them January 1st. And I've done that, and it's interesting. They're like kids, I think. If you don't get them out on the landing board when they're 45 days old and get them going in and out of the trap and get them doing their little flutters, their little fly around little circles and down the driveway and back up. And I've done that. I've had my insulated coveralls on and my big woolly hat, and I'm standing out there with a broom watching for hawks, right? And get those babies, going. If you don't do that, I think they just get stupid. They get lazy. You miss that opportunity. It's probably like, taking a child and not sending it to kindergarten and grade 1, 2, and 3, and then just popping it into grade 4 when it's 10 years old and expect it to be able to learn, right? It's missed that part where they just soak it up, right? So I hate late breds. It's always just a chore. You've got your main team, you got them going, you got them training, and then I got this group. I had this year. I had a couple guys that brought me some youngsters that were late. They were, May babies. Got them here in June. Just because we start racing so soon, it's like, okay, what am I going to do with these things? I got to get them going. They weren't even kitted up flying yet. And I thought, okay, I'm taking them down the road. I took them 2 miles away, right? And 30 babies, okay? And I chased them out, and one of them flew right into a tree. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to see you again. But the other 29 went up, and they're flying all over the place. And it took them all day to get home, one at a time. But by the end of the day, I had 29 birds home. And the next day, I took them back to the same spot, and it took them a couple hours to get home. And I took them to that spot about 6 times, and then they were beating me home, right? So that's 1 week gone. And then I take them 5 miles, right? And again, takes them a couple hours, and they all came together in a group. Tossed them there a couple times. Then I went 7 miles a couple times. Then I went 10 miles a couple times. And then I went 20 miles. And then I went 40 miles. Well, now those birds are caught right up. And it's like, I would never do that with my early bred team. We're so careful with them. We take them, because you don't want to lose them, right? But when you get those late breds, it's like, yeah, I don't care if I lose you or not, because I don't need you, right? But they react so good, so well, really. They're not darkened either. They're just natural, and I find natural pigeons will always fly better than a darkened pigeon. Again, I think they get kind of lazy. They're going through that body mold. They don't want to fly really so much because they're really loose in the feather, and it's hard to keep the weight off them because they're darkened up and they're already 3 months old by the time you start letting them out. Yeah, just different situations, right? So
What do you think is like a more common mistake that you see someone who's just getting into racing pigeons? What do you think the most common mistake is, whether it is like loft designs or just coming into the sport?
I think the biggest mistake that most guys, I mean, all of us are guilty of, is overcrowding. Guys have said over the years that the loft will tell you how many pigeons it should have, and it's kind of interesting. Like the one loft that I have is 6 by 16, so it's 96 square feet, right? An important thing too is to build it just over your height. You don't want a loft with an 8 foot ceiling, so the bird's gonna fly over your head. Like I'm 6'5", maybe 6'4", and now I'm shrinking a little bit, I think. But the inside of my loft is 6'6", right? So that loft has 72 box perches in it, okay, along that 16-foot wall. So I think, okay, I can put 72 birds in there. Well, every year I end up with about 45 to 50 birds is the right number, right? And if I only put 50 birds in there, I don't lose any. But if I put 70 in there, I'll lose 20 of them until I have 50,
Huh.
right? And I've done that test a couple times where I've just started, okay, I'm only going to put 50 birds in this loft, and I go to the first race with 48 pigeons. But if I put 70 in, I go to the first loft with 40, the first race with 48 pigeons, right? So that's an important consideration. The more space you can give them, the better.
Because I've heard numbers like a square foot of pigeon, which just seems crazy to me. I mean, what would you say? I mean, so off of the numbers that you said, you're giving your birds a good amount of space there.
2 square feet, right? Like, I figure if I got 48 pigeons times 2 square feet, that's 96 square feet, which is exactly what that loft is, right? So that's pretty much what it is 2 square feet. And again, maybe in a southern climate where you've got an open floor and everything else, maybe you can put more than that in. I don't know. I can't have no experience with that regard, but I know up here when the lofts are closed off, that seems to be the magic number. One thing I wanted to mention, that little conversation we just had about the late breds, you watch a lot of these one loft races that guys send birds to, and a lot of these races keep the birds locked up for 3 or 4 months before they let them out. I just look at what happens here with these late breds when I push them like that, and I wonder if a lot of these big losses we see in one loft races aren't a result of that same situation where the birds aren't getting out and getting that kindergarten training, when they should. And I understand it's hard, like, unless they have it set up in a way where they can take 1 month's worth of entries and start letting them out and getting them going, and then it turns into an all-day project for them, right? But I think there's a lot of comparisons there to think about.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense, though. They miss out on that really early development on learning.
I always kind of thought if I'm going to send to a one loft race, I want to send early so that the birds got a chance to mature and develop an immune system. And after watching this, I'm kind of thinking, you know what, maybe it's better to send them late so that they don't get that opportunity to get lazy, and if they get sick and die, because they're too young and everybody else is too old, well, so be it. But I kind of wonder if the ones that are there won't be better off. Again, that saying up here about May babies go all the way. I mean, baby born in May will be flying 350 to 400 miles at the end of September. They do it.
We're coming up against the clock here, but this has been a really interesting and fun talk. And Bill, I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to have met you and talked about things. So.
And we'll do it again sometime.
Okay. Have a good night.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you for listening to another ad-free, listener-requested episode of the All About Pigeons podcast. If you like the show and want to help us keep it going, as well as supporting our other pigeon promotional work, head over to our website at pigeonpod, that's pigeonpod.com, and make a donation. We are a non-profit public charity, so once you've made your donation, you'll receive an email with a tax-deductible receipt. If you can't donate today, please help us out by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Any episode requests, upcoming pigeon shows, competition results, or you just want to send a shout out for a club or a friend to be read on air, just email it over to staff@pigeonpod.com. And make sure to check out the one-of-a-kind pigeon t-shirts, hats, and other swag at our website, pigeonpod.com. Thanks again for listening, and remember, together the hobby thrives. Support each other and enjoy your pigeons.